So I kind of want to touch then on this next thing with Black Lives Matter, the marathon movement. It is a marathon movement in one sense, but I also will say it's not just a marathon movement. Every and any movement is a never-ending story. Every and any movement is a never-ending story. I think that's the first thing we have to acknowledge. America is still fighting to figure out what it is and who it is. So America's still fighting its own revolutionary war, bless its heart. We Americans are still fighting a civil war. That's crazy apparent right now. This is still a part of that. The civil rights movement, this is just the next big light of fire in it. Women's rights, still a fight. LGBTQIA rights, still a fight. We have not stopped any movement that has started in this country. The rabble tends to die down, the fire tends to die down, but, you know, show me a movement that's done and I'll show you a country that is finished existing. Because every day is a part of the movement, every day is a part of that fight. It's part of what we have to acknowledge and accept in this. It's why we have to continuously educate. It's why we have to constantly be aware of our preservation of ourselves to preserve our causes. It's why there are people still marching today that were marching for things last week and last year and 5 years ago and 15 years ago and 25 years ago and so on, because it's all ongoing. So with that, you know, I bring it back to Sibley saying the Black Lives Matter movement, as you know, it is described, if you look it up and you Google it even, it says, you know, we're a movement. There is no set end in sight for it. I almost think of it like another foundation. If the work is done for Black Lives Matter to be marching in the streets, then the work shifts for Black Lives Matter to continuing to educate, continuing to provide resources, continuing to provide events and build up organizations and build communication and build bridges and build communities. And so I think that's, you know, one of the things that is misunderstood, that people are kind of like, you know, well, what's the end game for this? There's no one end game. The end game for Black rights movement is the same end game as the civil rights movement, is the same as women's rights, as the same as LGBTQIA+ rights. So the end is when we all have our utopia and we can all stop having to fight to level our playing field, to feel that we're equally respected. And that's actually something that I think we need to help other people realize, that it's a movement, but no movement ever truly ends. And so it's one of those things where we have to kind of get past that idea. A lot of us are on the idea of just like, well, it's going to have an ending. Well, sure, but only when every other movement has an ending. And that's okay. That's okay. You know, that's part of what we have to realize. We have to acknowledge that. We have to celebrate it, that it's like, this is another one that's just in the cause as much as anything else. You know, when will the women's rights movement all be said and done? When women have every right to control themselves and their lives as they should. When's that going to happen? It should have already happened. It absolutely should have already happened by now. That movement will end when it's all there. The Black Lives Matter movement will end when we are in a world that wholly agrees that Black lives truly, fully, and wholly matter just as much. So it's a matter of knowing that we have to keep working towards that. If you haven't checked out blacklivesmatter.com, I highly recommend it. Let's see if I can do this successfully this time. Activate screen share. And bam. Are we seeing the Black Lives Matter homepage? Awesome. if you haven't checked it out, come and check this out. It's full of so much information, and it helps you to realize this is about so many more things than just marching in the street. You know, even as they say it here, it's calling it, it's referring as it is a movement. Join the movement to fight for freedom, liberation, and justice. These are the principles here. There is this great new web series that they started. I started watching these episodes. There's just a few of them up, called What Matters and What Listens. And it gives you more insight to people who are helping to lead the charge, as well as prominent Black figures, people of color in the community. It highlights information about things going on that are happening, sponsored, supported by Black Lives Matter. It also, you know, gives you more insight about what's happening within Black communities and COVID-19, because it's just another pandemic within this pandemic, within the many different systemic pandemics happening in our country right now. It's a really informative website that illuminates so much more about what's going on in this movement and what its principles, what its merits are, beyond thinking that it's just protesting in the streets and defunding the police.